Welcome to CIS 579, Technology of E-Business. This is Chapter 13, Implementing E-Commerce Systems, from Justification to Successful Performance. The learning objectives for this chapter include being able to describe the major components of e-commerce, being able to describe the need for justifying e-commerce investments, understanding the difficulties in measuring and justifying e-commerce investments, being able to recognize the difficulties in establishing intangible metrics, being able to list and describe traditional and advanced methods of justifying e-commerce investments, being able to describe some examples of e-commerce justification, being able to describe the role of economics in e-commerce evaluation, being able to discuss the steps in developing an e-commerce system, being able to describe the major e-commerce development strategies, being able to list the various e-commerce development methods along with their benefits and limitations, being able to discuss the major outsourcing strategies, being able to describe the criteria used in selecting software vendors and packages. You should be able to describe e-commerce organizational structure, business process management, and change management. And lastly, you should be able to understand how product, industry seller, and buyer characteristics impact the success of e-commerce. Up until this point, we've talked about e-commerce from the perspective of the different business models that exist, the different revenue streams, or revenue models, things of that nature. This chapter really focuses more on what it takes to implement an e-commerce system, some of the considerations that we need to take into account. For example, being able to justify the economics of it. Does it make sense to invest in e-commerce in our particular situation? We have to make decisions about whether to acquire or develop our own e-commerce solution. In other words, do we need to develop our own? Do we have the needs and the means to be able to do so? Or will it make more sense to buy a solution off the shelf that we can adjust our business to that particular solution? Organizational readiness and impacts of e-commerce. In other words, how are we going to organize e-commerce within our organization? Who is they going to, where is the department going to be? Who are they going to report to? Things like that. How are we going to deal with the business processes that are going to have to change when we incorporate e-commerce into our organization? What are the impacts on marketing, manufacturing, and the people that are in our organization? And what are some of the technical issues, such as connecting other information systems in our organization? What are some of those, and what are the impacts going to be there? And lastly, how to succeed. What are some of the critical success factors that are out there that we have to achieve in order to be successful in implementing e-commerce? All of these factors can be put together in a framework that we see here in Exhibit 13.1, the elements of e-commerce implementation. And you can see the justification and economics there on the left, along with system acquisition of development, organizational readiness, and organizational impacts. And these all affect our decision to deploy and adopt an e-commerce solution. Depending on our implementation of the various critical success factors, we have opportunities to improve our organizational performance. Before the dot-com bust, there was irrational exuberance, if you will, over e-commerce. It was kind of seen as a panacea. It was something that was going to fix everything. There was infinite upside and virtually no downside. The benefit of the crash was that it really led to a back to the basics movement. The idea that e-commerce investments, and that's what they were, investments, needed to make sense. In other words, some investments are better than others, and that's really kind of the point of these next few slides, or this section of the text. Other reasons why e-commerce justification is needed. E-commerce is not necessarily a solution to all problems. Therefore, e-commerce must compete for funding and resources with other internal and external projects. In other words, an e-commerce project is a project just like any other project that an organization might have, whether it be in marketing or manufacturing or other projects throughout the organization. Some large companies and many public organizations mandate a formal evaluation of requests for funding. Some companies are required to assess the success of e-commerce projects after completion and later, on a periodic basis. And this is kind of the idea of closing the loop, of figuring out what worked and what didn't work. And lastly, the success of e-commerce projects may be assessed in order to pay bonuses to those involved with the project. In other words, if the e-commerce is a success, a lot of the people involved get bonuses. If they're not, you don't get those bonuses. As far as e-commerce investment categories and benefits, to really be able to, before we can really get into the justification, the reasons for justifying some of these investments, it might be easier or beneficial to kind of figure out some of the distinctions between the different types of e-commerce investments. So categorizing them so we can identify benefits. One way of looking at these investments is to break them up in terms of infrastructure versus applications. Infrastructure investments are really the foundation of e-commerce applications in an enterprise. So this is going to include investments in things like servers or intranets, extranets, data centers, data warehouses, knowledge bases, etc. In some cases, there may be the need to integrate some various applications and things like that. Infrastructure investments are really long-term investments, and like I said, serve as a foundation for your actual applications. Applications are specific projects and specific programs for achieving certain business objectives. So they're the actual applications, the things that are actually used by users, whether they be internal users or external users. The major reasons that companies invest in IT and e-commerce are to improve business processes, lower costs, improve productivity, increase customer satisfaction and retention, increase revenue and market share, reduce time to market, and gain competitive advantage. So how is an e-commerce investment justified? Well, at least from a financial perspective, we want to look at the cost of the e-commerce project, and we want to look at the benefits of the e-commerce project. How much money is it going to save us? How much revenue is it going to generate for us? And this allows us to do a cost-benefit analysis. There's really a variety of different ways to financially justify investment in an e-commerce project. Some of the common ways are through net present value, return on investment, payback periods, are three particularly common ways of financially analyzing an investment. And it really doesn't matter what type of an investment that is, whether it's in e-commerce or otherwise. As far as what needs to be justified and when should the justification take place, keep in mind that not every e-commerce project necessarily needs to be justified. Now, don't take that as a blanket statement of saying this is too difficult, therefore we don't need to justify it. That's definitely not the case, and that's probably what we saw in the .com bust or before that that led to that. But the reality is there are some situations where we don't necessarily have to do that. Some of those situations might be when the investment is particularly small. It may cost more to do the analysis than it does to do the project. When the relevant data are not available, are inaccurate, or too volatile. I'm not so sure about this one. I probably disagree a little bit with the authors on this one. If the details are that vague, it is probably a situation that requires additional scrutiny rather than simply walking away because it's too difficult. When the e-commerce project is mandated, in other words, if you're required to implement a particular e-commerce project to be able to comply with a legal statute or some sort of a regulatory mandate, you may not have a choice but to implement an e-commerce solution. Even when formal analysis is not required, an organization should conduct at least some qualitative analysis to explain the logic of investing in an e-commerce project. In order to conduct a cost-benefit analysis, we need to be able to identify relevant metrics. And a metric is a specific measurable standard against which actual performance is compared. We need to properly identify the metric. It allows us to describe the cost or the benefits or the ratio or something of that nature. And appropriate metrics can really help to help organizations in terms of driving the behavior of the organization. Metrics can be the basis for specific goals and plans. They can define the value proposition of business models. They can communicate a business strategy to the workforce through performance targets, etc. Metrics need to be defined properly with a clear way to measure them. For example, revenue growth can be measured in a variety of different ways, including things like total dollars or percentage change over time, or percentage growth as compared to the entire industry. So there's a variety of different ways to define it, and when we decide to use a particular metric, we need to be very specific in identifying how we are defining that measure. Otherwise, the metrics that we might be using may be open to interpretation. We want to avoid that. Metrics are expressed by a set of key performance indicators, KPIs, which are quantitative expressions of critically important metrics, often known as critical success factors. KPIs are continuously monitored by the organization through various tools such as web analytics, financial reports, and marketing data. And they reflect actual performance, and we use that actual performance and compare that to our desired KPIs, key performance indicators, and planned metrics. If there's a gap, in other words, if there's a difference between the two, if we're falling short, obviously we need to take corrective action. We either need to modify what we're doing, or we need to adjust our goals. Exhibit 13.3 shows the process of using metrics. It's a cyclical process that begins with setting up goals and objectives for organizational and e-commerce performance, which is then expressed by a set of metrics. You can kind of see this process here as it unfolds. And it is a cyclical process in the sense that you create those goals and vision, and as you go through the process, you identify any needs or that gap that we were referring to in the previous slide, and you adjust your organizational goals and vision and objectives accordingly. You either ramp them up if you're achieving them, you modify them to become more realistic if you're not, things of that nature. Now, I mentioned web analytics a moment ago when we were talking about KPIs, and web analytics is a tool that can be used to monitor the performance of our organization and how closely we are in terms of our KPIs. Web analytics is the measurement, collection, analysis, and reporting of internet data for purposes of understanding and optimizing web usage. And traditionally, we tend to think of web analytics as a tool for measuring or assessing our website traffic, identifying where the pages that visitors are visiting, how long they're staying on pages, and things of that nature. But it can really be used for a lot more than just that. For example, it can be used as a tool for e-commerce market research. It can be used for performance evaluation. It can be used to help companies measure the results of traditional print advertising campaigns, and so on. So there's a lot of different ways that web analytics can be used. It's really up to organizations to be able to identify what their specific metrics are and determine how web analytics can help them to answer some of those questions. The e-commerce justification process really kind of depends on the specific situation, but it can be a very complex process. The next slide illustrates 5 areas that really need to be considered in the justification of IT projects. In Chapter 12, we talked about some of these, specifically strategic and tactical considerations, but there's other, due to the complexity of the process, there's other difficulties in conducting such justifications. Some of those difficulties include things like the data and data analysis issues. Data or the analysis of the data may hide productivity gains. For example, certain industries like service are particularly difficult to measure improvements in terms of quality and efficiency. It's not as easy as, say, a manufacturing environment where you can very easily measure the inputs and very easily measure the outputs. It's a little more difficult when it comes to service. E-commerce productivity gains in one area may be offset by losses in the other. The concept of cannibalism comes to mind here, whereby the implementation of an e-commerce solution, you increase sales in the e-commerce environment, which may really be robbing sales from the traditional sales channels. And so even though it looks really good for e-commerce, for the organization as a whole, it may not be quite as rosy. Hidden costs and benefits. Some costs and benefits are less visible or even completely hidden. Examples of hidden costs or benefits include things like currency fluctuations or the need to upgrade software and hardware over time. Incorrectly defining what is measured. The results of any investment justification depend on what is actually measured. For example, to assess the benefits of e-commerce investment, one should usually look at productivity improvement in the area where the e-commerce project was installed. However, productivity increase may not necessarily be a result of profitable improvements. The problem of definitions can be overcome by using appropriate metrics and key performance indicators. There are other difficulties as well. Things like time lags may throw off productivity measurements. Sometimes it simply takes a long time for an e-commerce investment to really come to fruition and show the savings or benefits that you are anticipating. The book gives an example of a study that points to ECRM taking 5 to 6 years to show significant positive results. So that's a significant investment, not only in terms of cost, but in terms of time as well. Exhibit 13.4 illustrates those 5 areas that need to be considered when trying to justify IT projects. Some of these were discussed in Chapter 12, specifically strategic and tactical considerations. This kind of gives you an idea of the other 3 areas and what some of the components or makeup of those areas are. Exhibit 13.5 shows some of the difficulties in finding the relationship between e-commerce investment and organizational performance. The exhibit shows that the relationship between investment and performance is indirect. Factors such as shared e-commerce and IT assets and how they're used can impact organizational performance and make it difficult to assess the value of an IT or e-commerce investment. So when you see there on the left the IT expenditure, where we make the initial expenditure for some sort of an investment, we generate or create some sort of an IT asset. That IT asset has some sort of an organizational impact, which ultimately, hopefully, positively affects organizational performance. So it's an indirect relationship between expenditure and performance, and sometimes that can get lost in the translation. Adding to the difficulties in measuring and justifying e-commerce investments is the concept of intangible costs and benefits. Tangible costs and benefits are ones that are easily defined, easily measured. We pretty much know them when we see them. Intangible costs and benefits, though, are ones that are a little bit harder to define. We don't necessarily have data that we can just go out and grab. So it may be necessary to consider intangible benefits in a way that reflect their potential impact. And that's where handling intangible benefits comes in. The idea that we're going to make our best guesstimate or a rough estimate as to what those benefits are or what those costs are, and then move forward with our traditional ways of assessing a particular project, whether it be return on investment, cost-benefit analysis, whatever it happens to be. It's really more of an art than it is a science, and as an art, the more you do it, the better you get at it. In order to make sure that all projects are evaluated on equal footing, you really need to apply some sort of a methodology or common approach or process to evaluating and justifying various e-commerce projects. And the authors attempt to lay out a potential process here. So you can lay an appropriate foundation for analysis with your vendor and then conduct your return on investment. Conduct a good research on metrics, including internal and external metrics, and validate them. Justify and document the cost and benefit assumptions. Document and verify all figures used in the calculation and clarify all assumptions. Do not leave out strategic benefits, including long-term ones. Is the project really bolstering the company's competitive and strategic advantage? Be careful not to underestimate costs and overestimate benefits, which tends to be a tendency of many managers, and obviously that has the potential to lead to project failure. Make figures as realistic as possible and include risk analysis. And commit all partners, including vendors and top management. Again, the idea is that by applying a methodology that you will evenly evaluate the various projects so that you're comparing apples to apples rather than apples to oranges. Before jumping into specific methods used in justification, I want to talk a little bit first about the hype cycle. The hype cycle is a concept that's been introduced by Gartner, which is a research firm. And it's a graphic representation of the maturity, adoption, and social application of specific IT tools. It's a way for organizations to evaluate some of the various e-commerce technologies and tools so that they can develop a strategy before they make investments in those areas in an effort to save money and make better, wiser investments. The hype cycle consists of 5 stages that reflect the adoption path of any technology follows. The first stage is the technology trigger, a breakthrough, public demonstration, product launch, or other event that generates significant media and industry interest, and hence the concept of hype in the title. Peak of inflated expectations, a phase of over-enthusiasm and unrealistic projections, during which a flurry of publicized activity by technology leaders may result in some successes, but more failures as the technology is pushed to its limits. The only enterprises making money at this stage are conference organizers, consultants, and magazine publishers. So it's really kind of the hype just being overhyped. Trough of disillusionment. That's the next step. The point at which the technology becomes unfashionable and the media abandons the topic because the technology did not live up to its inflated expectations. The fourth stage is the slope of enlightenment, focused on experimentation and solid hard work by an increasingly diverse range of organizations, lead to a true understanding of the technology's applicability, risks, and benefits. Commercial off-the-shelf methodologies and tools become available to ease the development process. The final stage is the plateau of productivity. The real-world benefits of the technology are demonstrated and accepted. Tools and methodologies are increasingly stable as they enter their second and third generation. The final height of the plateau varies according to whether the technology is broadly applicable or benefits only a niche market. The application of the hype cycle is that it really helps organizations to identify emerging technologies. Examination of the hype cycle can be useful to any organization that seriously considers the emerging tools of e-commerce. There are lots of opportunities that e-commerce investments create that go beyond just the additional revenue opportunities that exist. So when we talk about implementing e-commerce, we need to not only be aware of the opportunities for increased revenue, but also the potential to drive down costs. Certain e-commerce applications may allow us to, for example, invoice customers more efficiently, thus saving costs that way. So it's not all about revenue generation. As far as methodological aspects of justifying IT investments or e-commerce investments, one of the things that we need to do is be able to look at the different types of costs and be able to distinguish between them. For example, being able to distinguish between initial upfront costs and operating costs. The initial costs are the costs that we incur when we're first establishing the system. We're buying hardware, we're paying programmers, things of that nature. Versus the operating costs are the costs that we have on a day-to-day basis after that. We have to pay personnel to man a data center. We have periodic upgrades that we have to do. We have power consumption. So those are operating costs that are associated with those e-commerce investments. We have direct and indirect shared costs. The direct costs are fairly straightforward and fairly easily measured. Indirect costs, though, tend to be associated with infrastructure-related type costs. Oftentimes they may be related to several e-commerce or IT projects, but there's a need to be able to allocate these costs to specific projects so we can justify the investment in that specific project. So that certainly makes it a little bit more difficult to evaluate the value of a particular project, because we have to ferret out the costs associated with one project when it may be shared amongst several. And then there are also in-kind costs. Although it's easy to track monetary payments, costs may also be in kind. For example, contributions of a manager, contribution of machine time, and so on. These frequently are indirect shared costs or overhead, which complicates their calculation. There are a lot of different ways of trying to evaluate e-commerce investments. Some of the more traditional ones include these here. The return on investment method divides the total net benefits, revenue less costs for each year, by the initial cost. And this generates a ratio. The higher the ratio, the better the investment. Another method is the use of the payback period. In other words, trying to figure out how long it will take for the net benefits to pay back the entire initial investment. The net present value, or NPV analysis, converts future values of benefits to their present value equivalents by discounting them at the organization's cost of funds. The IRR, or internal rate of return, for an investment that requires and produces a number of cash flows over time, people use IRR. IRR is the discount rate that makes the net present value of those cash flows equal to zero. Some companies set a minimum acceptable IRR based on their own cost of capital and the minimum percentage return they'd like to see from their investments. A break-even analysis, or break-even point, is the point at which the benefits of a project are equal to the costs. Firms use this type of analysis to determine the point at which the e-commerce investment starts to pay for itself. More relevant ways of determining or justifying e-commerce investments as it relates to technology revolve around a few of these concepts. Total cost of ownership, for example. A formula for calculating the cost of owning, operating, and controlling an IT system. This is a term or a concept that's been tossed around in IT for quite some time now. It's also used in other areas, such as in the area of risk assessment, where you're trying to determine if a system were to go down, how much it would cost your organization. An alternative to this approach, not discussed in the book, is something known as NCO, network cost of ownership. And it's very similar in terms of calculating the cost of owning, operating, and controlling an IT system, except that it doesn't account for indirect costs, which TCO does. There's also total benefits of ownership, which is, again, very similar. Benefits of ownership that include both tangible and intangible benefits. Let's see, there's economic value added. Economic value added basically says that it's trying to quantify the net value added by an investment. It's return on invested capital generated by a company minus the cost of capital used in creating the cash flow. For example, if the earnings per share are, say, 12%, but the cost of capital is 10%, then they've made 2%. If it's the opposite of that, if the earnings per share were, say, 10% and the cost of capital were 12%, then the investment actually reduces rather than adds economic value. A lot of organizations will use more than one method to try to evaluate a project. In other words, they may combine payback period and the return on investment or something of that nature. It really depends on the organization as to which valuation methods they prefer. And oftentimes it's a good idea to use more than one. Once you've started gathering data, it's usually just as easy to gather data for one or two measurements as it is for a single measurement. So it certainly makes sense to go ahead and do that, and that way you can kind of make comparisons. If one approach says it's a good investment and another one doesn't, you can start to say, well, maybe this one needs a little bit closer scrutiny. Whereas if they both suggest, yes, we should move forward with this investment, you can feel more comfortable in moving forward with that particular investment. One last consideration is to look at the business return on investment versus the technology return on investment. In other words, just because you have the money to make the investment doesn't necessarily mean that it's still a good idea. For example, if the technology is significantly different than the current infrastructure that you already have in place, It may be more than just buying the technology. There may simply be too much to overcome to make it work with your existing system. So those are other considerations that need to be taken into account. Exhibit 13.6 basically just illustrates each one of those methods that we just got through talking about: IRR, net present value, or net worth, payback period, benefit to cost, cost benefit analysis or ratio, and economic value added. It also describes the advantages and disadvantages to each approach. And this is why a lot of organizations will use more than one approach to evaluate a particular investment opportunity, so that they can really get more than one perspective of the same investment or the same opportunity. When implementing traditional methods, one may encounter some difficulties. Therefore, the methods discussed earlier are frequently implemented using some calculators. The traditional methods of calculating return on investment involve fairly simple and straightforward formulas, and those formulas are available within Excel as functions and as well as other calculators that exist. Vendors and consulting companies have accumulated quite a bit of experience in developing metrics and tools called return on investment calculators to evaluate investments. One of the major sources of simple calculators is Baseline. It offers several dozen Excel-based calculators, some for free and others for a fee, and include examples such as calculating the return on investment, figuring the return on investment of RFID, comparing smartphones and laptops, figuring the return on investment of application performance management, determining your true total cost of ownership, calculating the return on investment of voice over IP, and determining the cost of video conferencing solution. In addition, Baseline offers tutorials, guides, statistical data, and more related to these calculators. Other calculators have been created by companies such as Nucleus Research, which is a research and advisory company that uses several return on investment calculators in helping businesses evaluate their IT investments. Still other calculators are available from various other companies such as Phoenix Technologies, Citrix's Zen Desktop, and Alienian Inc. Traditional methods are based only on tangible financial factors and may not be sufficient for many IT or e-commerce justifications. Some newer methods have evolved over time and include the ability to account for intangible factors such as customer satisfaction. These methods may supplement the return on investment traditional methods, or it may replace them entirely. Some of these approaches include financial approaches, multi-criteria approaches, ratio approaches, and portfolio approaches. Financial approaches are methods that consider only those impacts that can be valued monetarily. They focus on incoming and outgoing cash flows as a result of the investment made. Multi-criteria approaches consider both financial impacts and non-financial impacts that cannot be, or cannot easily be, expressed in monetary terms. Ratio approaches use several ratios to assist in e-commerce investment evaluation. The metrics used usually are financial in nature, but other types of metrics may be used as well. Portfolio approaches apply portfolios or grids to plot several investment proposals against decision-making criteria. Exhibit 13.7 summarizes representative advanced methods useful in evaluating e-commerce investments. So you see there value analysis, information economics, scoring methodology, benchmarks, management by maximum, real options valuation, balanced scorecards, which we've talked a little bit before, performance dashboards, and activity-based costing and justification. The methods and tools we've been talking about can be used alone, or they can be used in some sort of combination, or they can be modified to examine a specific e-commerce project and examine it and justify the investment in that particular project. Here we're listing several different examples of different e-commerce projects that might require some sort of a justification. For example, justifying e-procurement and looking at an e-commerce system that's not just about necessarily buying and selling, but also about identifying various suppliers, getting approval from buyers, processing purchase orders, fulfilling orders, etc. And we can use all of these as various metrics to be able to assess and assess such an investment. We can look at increased order fulfillment rates, for example, or increased on-time deliveries. And we can use those types of metrics to be able to determine whether or not that's going to be a good investment. We can justify a portal. We can, in terms of looking at a simpler interface for finding and navigating content via a browser, or to assess improvement in business content and increase in the number of business users. So we can try to use some of those metrics to be able to justify an investment in creating a portal for an organization. We can use some of these methods to justify social networking and the use of other Web 2.0 technologies. Investments in mobile and computing, mobile computing, and investment in RFID projects, as well as security projects. So all of these different methods that we've been talking about can be used to justify lots and lots of different types of IT projects. Now, all of these different methods that we've been talking about really has one of two different aims, one of two different things that it wants to accomplish that we want to do with them. We either want to become more efficient and increase our revenues, or we want to reduce our costs. So it's really an economic issue, and that's kind of where this section on the text is going. It's talking about reducing our production costs. So we look at our production curves and our average cost versus how much we're producing. Optimally, we want to have our average cost as low as it can possibly be. It doesn't quite work the same for digital products. With digital products, the more we produce, the lower the average cost goes. So we want to produce as much as we can because it doesn't really cost us anymore to make an additional copy. E-commerce generates some shifts in our traditional view of economics. Specifically, when we look at the production function represents a mathematical formula that indicates that for the same quantity of production, say Q, companies either can use a certain amount of labor or they can invest in more automation. In other words, they can substitute IT for capital labor. But when e-commerce enters the picture, it shifts the function inward, lowering the amount of labor and/or capital needed to produce that same level of Q. Again, e-commerce provides a competitive advantage, allowing companies to sell at lower prices than their competition. We'll see a graphical representation here on the next slide in Exhibit 13.10. Another shift, if you will, is with respect to agency costs, and we'll see this again on the next slide as well. But it shows the economics of a firm's agency costs or administrative costs. These are the costs that are incurred in ensuring that certain support and administrative tasks related to production are performed as intended by some sort of an agent. In the old economy, agency costs grew with the size and complexity of the firm, reaching a high level of cost quickly and frequently preventing companies from growing to a very large size. In other words, there was a critical mass that these organizations could grow to. Once you grew to that size, you became too unwieldy to really be able to effectively manage and run. In the digital economy, though, the agency cost curve shifts inward. This means that as a result of e-commerce, companies can significantly expand their business without too much of an increase in administrative costs. Again, this is a competitive advantage for rapidly growing companies. So here in Exhibit 13.10, we see the graphical representations of the two curves that we were just talking about. We see the production function before, in which where we see production both with and without the introduction of e-commerce. We've become much more efficient with e-commerce. Same thing with agency costs, that we're able to grow to a larger size. With e-commerce, it allows us to basically do more with less. Transaction costs are another economic term or concept that exists in the physical world. And these are costs that are associated with the distribution, sale, or exchange of products and services, including the cost of searching for buyers and sellers, gathering information, negotiating, decision-making, monitoring the exchange of goods and legal fees, etc. These exist both in the physical world as well as in the virtual world. But in the virtual world, we're able to reduce a lot of these transaction costs to much lower costs. We'll see an example of that here on the next slide. So here we can see a graphical representation on the economic effects of e-commerce on transaction costs. And we can see that with e-commerce, it shifts our cost curve inward. And it does this by reducing our search costs, reducing our information costs, our negotiation costs, our decision costs, our monitoring costs, and our legal related costs. And this allows our organization to be more competitively positioned to compete against our competitors. On the flip side, though, e-commerce allows us to increase our revenue. So rather than just become more efficient and save on costs, it also allows us to increase our potential for revenue. So this allows us to develop our reach versus richness. In other words, with e-commerce, we're able to really provide some very rich content. Think about delivering a magazine in the mail. There's only so much you can do in terms of representing a product. Whereas in an online environment, you can potentially see it in motion. You can rotate things. You can hear things. You can see product demonstrations and things of that nature. So the richness becomes very much more engaging than it would be in, say, just a magazine. At the same time, our reach is extended significantly. We have the potential to reach every person on the planet through e-commerce platforms. Not quite as easy to do through the mail system. So it allows us to shift that curve outward and increase our sales. Related to the economics of e-commerce is the concept of risk and being able to reduce transaction friction or risk. For example, you may have some buyers that are reluctant to use e-commerce and providing certain services such as the ability to track packages helps to reduce some of the anxiety that certain purchasers may have. Being able to provide comparison shopping reduces some of the friction, if you will, of some purchasers that may be afraid of purchasing the wrong good or service online. That by having comparison engines online, it allows them to make comparisons quickly and easily, and it reduces some of their anxiety, it reduces some of that risk. As far as facilitating product differentiation, e-commerce can provide differentiation through better product information, informing users on how to use the product, how to replenishment, or how to provide feedback potentially. E-commerce can also increase agility. E-commerce can provide firms with the agility to monitor, report, and quickly to respond to changes in the marketplace and the business environment. Companies with agile systems can respond to customer requests quickly, improving customer service. All of this leads us to the idea of that we need to potentially evaluate the value of an e-commerce company as a whole. This idea of valuation of the fair market value of a business, or the price at which a property would change hands between a willing buyer and a willing seller, who are both informed and under no compulsion to act. For a publicly traded company, the value can be readily obtained by multiplying the selling price of the stock by the number of available shares. But obviously, not every company is a publicly traded company. So there's a variety of different ways that we can try to evaluate or value an e-commerce company. One is the comparable method, an approach to try to identify another company that is of similar makeup, similar size, similar industry, similar position, things of that nature, that we can identify a value for, and then relate the value of that company to the company that you're looking at. There's the financial performance method, a method that uses projections of future earnings, usually five years or longer, cash flows, and so on, to find the net present value of the company. Then there's the venture capital method, which basically uses combinations of the first two methods to come up with some sort of evaluation. They find venture capital firms to invest in startups and usually take them through to their initial public offerings. These are all different approaches to determining values of an e-commerce company. There's not, again, a lot of these are more art than science, and as a result there is a degree of risk whenever you're doing this. So once we've determined that the organization can benefit from being online, we can start to figure out the business type, the product line, the organization of our e-commerce unit, and our budget, and what functionality that the e-commerce system needs and how the website should be developed. Now keep in mind, we're talking about an e-commerce system, not an e-commerce website, not an e-commerce server or anything like that. We're talking about an e-commerce system, which means we're talking about different components that all work in concert to be able to achieve some goal, some purpose. And Exhibit 13.4 tries to show you some of the relationships between those various elements of an e-commerce system. So obviously we see people that are involved there. We see the hardware and the architecture. We see the software applications. But we should also see things like site designs, the networks, the standards, project team, original capabilities. When you see original capabilities, think about opportunities to set yourself apart from your competitors. It's your ability, it's your competitive advantage or opportunity for competitive advantage of finding your own little niche that your competitors haven't quite identified yet. And when we talk about system, we need to start thinking about a cycle now, because a system is particularly this type of system is a closed system in the sense that it's cyclical, or it's circular. It feeds on itself. We start out with planning and identifying and justifying the e-commerce system that we have in mind, and that's kind of what most of the rest of the chapter has been about. Once we've got that in place, we've identified an opportunity, we've been able to justify it financially and technologically, and we've planned it all out, we can start to create that e-commerce architecture. We can purchase the goods, we can the hardware, we can purchase the services and have programmers code things and things of that nature. We can select the development option. We can test and install and integrate and deploy our approach. And then we get to the operation phase where we're actually running it. We're maintaining it. We have to make updates, upgrades periodically. And then over time that's going to begin to become dated, and we have to start to plan, identify, and justify those upgrades or replacements of parts of our system, or replacements of the entire system. So again, it's that circular part of the system. So that leads us to our 5-step approach to developing an e-commerce system: identifying, justifying, and planning the e-commerce system, creating an e-commerce architecture, selecting a development option. In other words, we don't necessarily have to develop everything in-house. We can purchase services online, we can purchase canned solutions, things of that nature, or we can decide to develop everything in-house. We can run our own database, use our own scripts, create our own shopping carts, etc. It really depends on our specific needs and our ability. Once we've determined that, we can install, test, integrate, and deploy our e-commerce applications, and then again operate, maintain, and update the system. Here's another perspective of the same thing. In step 1, product identification, justification, and planning, we start to think about IT as an enabler. And we look at the business goals and our information needs. We look at the functionalities that we need. We look at the problems that we need solved. And we try to identify the various e-commerce projects that are out there and justify which ones we want to make investments in and which ones we want to pass over. In step 2, e-commerce architecture, we look at the information architecture, our data architecture, application architecture, technical architecture, and our organizational architecture and feasibility. With that in mind, now we kind of have the problem defined, we have our current situation in mind, and we can, at this point, we can move to step 3 and start thinking about development or acquisition options. Do we build it? Do we buy it? Do we lease? Do we partner with somebody else, or join some sort of an exchange or marketplace? So we have a lot of different options about how we want to merge an e-commerce solution with our current architecture that's already in place to address the problems that we've identified in step 1. With step 4, testing, installation, and integration, we need to test that installation. We need to make sure that it integrates with our existing systems. We need to train users. We need to check security. So there's a variety of different things that we need to do at that step. And then lastly, step 5, operations, maintenance, and updating. We basically are using the system on a day-to-day basis. As little things pop up, we maintain them. We back up our databases, for example, or our data. We install patches, things of that nature. Once we get to the point that it's obsolete or parts of it are no longer functioning, we update or we replace sections of it, and we really kind of start this process over again. And this slide just kind of goes into a little bit more detail about some of the steps. Step 2 there, e-commerce architecture. A plan for organizing the underlying infrastructure and applications of the site. We've already talked about that. We talked about step 3, selecting development option. We talked about step 4, installing, testing, and integrating and deploying e-commerce applications. We can do unit testing. We can do integration testing. Unit testing is testing the application software modules one at a time. We're testing them in isolation. And that's fine to identify certain types of problems. But ultimately, we need to move to integration testing, testing the combination of application modules acting in concert. In other words, just because we have one piece of code working doesn't mean that it's interacting with other modules at the same time. So when we take payment information, for example, for something, just because we're able to process the payment, it doesn't necessarily mean that that order is also removing the item from inventory. So we need to test them as an integrated testing in an integrated testing environment as well, to make sure that not only is money collected, but our inventory is maintained properly as well. Another form of testing is usability testing, testing the quality of the user experience when interacting with a website. Certainly from a human-computer interaction perspective, very important. The easier it is to use, the more likely people are to use it. So you want it to be easy to use, you want it to be functional, but you want it to be very intuitive, where they're not having to ask for help or where they're abandoning their shopping cart. And then acceptance testing, determining whether a website meets the original business objectives and vision. In other words, a lot of times programmers have a tendency to hear that there's a problem and then they immediately go off and start coding without really determining what the real need is. So you want to make sure that you're actually coming up with a solution that addresses the needs that you've identified earlier on. Step 5, operations, maintenance, and updates. We talked about that. That's really the day-to-day operations, maintenance in terms of backing up and security concerns, things like that. Updating as new features are needed or fixing bugs that weren't found earlier in the process, to ultimately identifying shortcomings of the program to the point that the program needs to be significantly augmented or replaced. Lastly, there's the idea of managing the development process, and this is really kind of an overarching thing, that this whole process from step 1 through step 5 has to be managed. Somebody has to champion this project, an e-commerce project, to make sure that it goes from the initial planning, idea and planning stages to the operations and maintenance and update stages. And that can be, especially for a large project, can be very time-consuming and a very daunting task. That's where the idea or concept of project management comes in. If you haven't had a project management class, by all means, I definitely recommend it. Whether you take it from our department, you take it out of the Department of Management, certainly check into it. It's a very lucrative field, and there's a reason for it. It's a tough job, but it can be very rewarding as well. Okay, so we talked just briefly earlier about some of the development strategies for an e-commerce project, and there's basically four different options that we have. We can develop on the application or the solution in-house from scratch or with off-the-shelf components, and there's certain advantages and disadvantages to this approach. One of the big advantages is we can get the exact application that we want. We're really able to customize it, get exactly what we want, how we want. It should do exactly what we want when we take this approach. The downside is it tends to take longer, tends to cost more, and we become responsible for any of the maintenance and updates that the system needs, because it's been developed in-house. And that tends to be not quite as bad for if you're using very common components, very common programming languages, for example, common hardware, etc. But when you start to deviate and use very specialized things, sometimes keeping the expertise in-house is difficult. So that's something to be aware of. We can buy a packaged application designed for a particular type of e-commerce site. This offloads some of that development to a third party, to the person, the organization that you're purchasing the application from. And so that's a big plus. You can save some of your development costs that way. The downside is you don't necessarily have as tight an integration with some of your in-house applications. You may have to change some of your business processes to work with the application. You can outsource systems development. You can pay somebody else to create a custom solution for you. But again, you're kind of locked into going back to them if you need any kind of updates or maintenance or anything like that. But you don't have to pay for ongoing staff to continue to maintain the application. And lastly, you can lease the application. Benefit is very low upfront cost, pretty quick in terms of getting things going. Downside is you don't own it. It's something that you're going to constantly have to be paying whoever it is you're leasing the application from. So there's pros and cons to all of these different approaches. It really depends on what the goals of the organization are as to which one's the best for your particular situation. Okay, so when we make the choice to develop an e-commerce application internally to our organization, we're considering insourcing. We're developing it in-house, which means we have to have the expertise, we have to hire the expertise, something of that nature, but we're committing to developing this application ourselves. Part of the goal is to maximize reusability and maximize interoperability. Reusability is the likelihood a segment of source code can be used again to add new functionalities with slight or no modification. The idea behind it is, why reinvent the wheel? If we can develop code that we can use over and over again, we're not having to constantly pay for redevelopment. If we're not able to do that, we're really not generating much in the way of efficiency of our code development. In terms of interoperability, we need to consider trying to integrate our e-commerce systems with the various other systems that we have in our organization as tightly as possible. That's one of the real advantages to in-house development, is we have this opportunity to really customize our software and get exactly what we want. So for example, we develop our e-commerce system, we need to integrate that system with, say, our point of sale system, our ability to process transactions. We need to integrate it with our inventory control system, for example, so we can credit or debit our inventory levels depending on what's occurring. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about interoperability, connecting people, data, and diverse systems. The term can be defined in a technical way or in a broad way, taking into account social, political, and organizational factors. So again, we're trying to integrate the various systems together so they operate as one larger coherent system. An alternative is to buy the application using off-the-shelf software, and essentially the idea is well, a couple of different ideas. We can take a turnkey approach where it's basically just a general purpose application that we can simply install, and for all practical purposes start the application when we're ready to go. We may have to load some of our data or something of that nature, but to a large degree the application's already been tested for us, so we don't have to worry about those types of issues. It's designed, updates and things like that are managed by the manufacturer, the software company that developed the package. So it tends to be a nice, quick approach to getting an application up and running. Now the downside is that type of approach makes it much more difficult to integrate with your current applications that you already have in your organization. It also may force an organization to change some of their business practices in terms of how data is entered, when data is entered, the various stages, things like that. So you tend to have to adjust your business processes to suit the software, or make modifications to the software, which sometimes you can do, sometimes you can't, depending on the application. An alternative approach is to outsource, and basically the idea is to pay somebody else to develop the system. You may not have the expertise internally to your company, and it may not be worth hiring developers to do something like that. But as an alternative, you may outsource the development of an e-commerce application and have them develop it. And in a lot of cases, you can get some of that functionality that you need. Still, another option to e-commerce development is the ability to lease an application or using software as a service. And this is a relatively new approach. I say relatively new because it's been around for a few years now, but it's something that's really starting to gain traction and become more commonplace, where essentially you don't have to house any of the software, storage, or anything else for that matter. A lot of this stuff can be done online, can be done on the cloud or in the cloud. And this obviously gives an organization an awful lot of flexibility. You don't have to have the expertise in house. You're able to get up and running very quickly with this type of approach. If you need things customized, you can oftentimes pay for that customization from the service provider. So it gives you a lot of that flexibility, reduces upfront costs, and all that kind of stuff. The downside is you lose control of your data to a degree. You're really relying on that service provider to continue to update their systems and make sure everything's running properly. If for some reason you decide to change service providers, you now have to worry about getting your data and transferring it to another service provider or bringing it in-house. You have privacy concerns, especially if you're housing customer data, personal information, things like that. So you have privacy considerations as well. But it is a way to get up and going very quickly, so it's an attractive approach for small and medium-sized businesses. There are still other development options that organizations have at their disposal. For example, they can potentially join an e-marketplace, in which case they can list their various products in the e-marketplace's directory to make them available for sale. Similarly, they can list them in a consortium, which is essentially the same thing. The only difference is that one of the players is actually the owner of the directory. They can join an auction or reverse auction third-party sites such as eBay. They can form joint ventures with some of their competitors, or they can take some sort of a hybrid approach and do multiple ones of these. As far as selecting a development option, they've got to answer a few different questions. One, they've got to talk about figure out who their target customers are. They got to think about what kinds of products and services will the business sell online. They got to think about whether or not customers are actually going to be able to order online, or if they can simply browse for products online and make their purchases in some other way. How are they going to promote their products and services? When it comes to transaction, eventually we want to be paid for our good or service, obviously. Are those transactions going to be processed online in real time, or are we going to do them in batches? What information such as sales, customer data, and advertising trends will the site collect? And lastly, what image should the web store reinforce? How is the web store different from those of the competition? So these are just some of the things that you have to think about when we're trying to pick which one of these options we want to go forward with for our particular situation. So e-commerce is not just about selling and collecting money online. It really can affect the entire organization. It can improve our marketing and sales, for example. Particularly when we start talking about digital products, we talk about movies, we talk about songs and software. These are things that are very well suited to be marketed, to be delivered, sold and delivered across the internet, making the potential for that process to be very streamlined and very efficient. As far as some of the other impacts of e-marketplaces, they're starting to transform organizations and the way that those organizations work. You start to think about the newspaper industry or traditional bookstores or traditional record stores, that e-business has significantly changed the way those organizations have to go about working. So, for example, that in the newspaper industry, their business models are having to change as advertisers move more and more away from print and move more to an online environment. These newspapers are having to adjust and modify their business model accordingly. Same thing with record stores. They're having to move to the online world, and obviously you see iTunes as a big player there, but you see other companies such as Google and Amazon trying to push their models forward. As far as the changing nature of work, it's really changing the way organizations structure themselves. You see a lot of organizations that are reducing the number of employees to a core essential staff and outsourcing whatever work they can to countries where wages are significantly lower. Basically, it allows them to concentrate on their core competencies and outsource the necessary tasks that really are not focal to their particular business. This creates all kinds of new opportunities, but it also adds or creates risk, and it forces people to think about new ways, to think in new ways about their jobs, about their careers, really about their salaries too. One area where work is changing is in the area of intermediation. We've talked about intermediation or disintermediation earlier in the semester. It's the idea that there are agents that mediate between sellers and buyers, and usually they're going to provide a couple of different types of services. They provide relevant information about demand, supply, prices, and requirements, and obviously this helps match buyers and sellers together. Unfortunately for intermediaries, a lot of that can be automated, so they're ripe to be disintermediated, removed from that process. Another service that they can offer is our value-added services, such as the transfer of products, escrow, payment arrangements, consulting, or assistance in finding a business partner. These are less easily removed from the process or automated. In a lot of cases, especially when you start talking about transferring of products, if it's a physical good, somebody has to do that transfer. So some of these can be automated, some of them cannot. There's a new term here in this section that you should be familiar with: re-intermediation. And this is basically where you have a streamlined supply chain where a player provides, an existing player starts to provide additional services, or a new player comes in to provide services and becomes another player, another link in that supply chain. And this is referred to as re-intermediation. And again, the idea is that they're stepping in to address one of the roles that we just got through talking about. Another way that e-commerce helps organizations to restructure and transform, if you will, is through a couple of different approaches: business process reengineering and business process management. And these are really kind of more managerial concepts. But the idea is that e-commerce provides a ripe opportunity, not only an opportunity, but the means with which to do it, to really affect significant change when it comes to business process reengineering and business process management. Business process reengineering is a methodology for conducting a comprehensive redesign of an enterprise's processes. The idea being that a lot of times organizations have been around for quite a while and they've done something a certain way for a long period of time, and that over time technology has changed, standards have changed, techniques, tools, things of that nature. All those have changed, and that there are potentially more efficient ways to do a particular process. Obviously, e-commerce allows us to automate an awful lot of things, and so this gives us a real good opportunity to be able to automate a lot of, paper pushing, for example. So e-commerce is very well suited for business process reengineering opportunities. Business process management is related to this concept. A holistic management approach focused on aligning all aspects of an organization with the wants and needs of clients, promotes business effectiveness and efficiency, while striving for innovation, flexibility, and integration with technology. So the idea is that it's not just about optimizing or bettermizing, as some people might say, individual processes. It's about optimizing individual processes in concert with various other processes and procedures that are done throughout an organization to optimize the organization as a whole, not the individual processes. And so it's a larger in scope when we start to talk about business process management and how those processes affect the organization as a whole. But e-commerce is not just about transforming businesses. In some cases, it's actually redefining organizations as a whole. For example, e-markets allow for new products to be created and for existing products to be customized in new and innovative ways. This leads us to the area of personalization and mass customization, which enables manufacturers to create specific products for each customer based on the customer's exact needs. In other words, they're able to really customize and tailor a particular product to a particular person, yet at the same time take advantage of some of the mass production capabilities that many manufacturers are so good at. A variety of different manufacturers have employed this approach, including Motorola, Dell, who was a real pioneer in this area, Mattel, Nike, Lego, etc. This also has huge impacts on manufacturing. E-commerce is changing manufacturing systems from mass production lines to demand-driven, just-in-time manufacturing. So it's converting it from a push-based production line to a pull-based production line. And that has significant effects on an organization's the way they do business. And so in other words, instead of having to stock as much inventory, they can wait until orders actually come in before they actually order their inventory. What this means is they have to have very well integrated systems with their various suppliers as well, so that demand can be addressed quickly and efficiently. The production systems are integrated with finance, marketing, and other functional systems, as well as with business partners and customers. Companies can direct customer orders to designers and/or to the production floor within seconds. Production cycles can be cut by 50% or more in some cases. So here's an example of how mass customization might work in somebody's case, such as a Nike, that somebody wants to customize a particular shoe and have that individual shoe that's unique and personalized to that individual. The process might go something like this. So I think you should see from this that e-commerce can be a very disruptive approach or technology to a business in terms of redefining that business or transforming that business, because it creates a lot of change, creates a lot of stress and pain, if you will. And if that's going to be the case, we have to figure out some sort of a process to manage that pain or manage that change. So this leads us to change management, a structured approach to shifting, transitioning individuals, teams, and organizations from a current state to a desired future state. It is an organizational process aimed at empowering employees to accept and embrace changes in their current business environment. Successful change management is more likely to occur if the following are included: benefits management and realization to define measurable stakeholders' aims, create a business case for their achievement, which can be continuously updated, and monitor assumptions, risks, dependencies, costs, return on investment, benefits, and cultural issues affecting the progress of the associated work. Also, effective communications that informs various stakeholders of the reasons for the change. In other words, answer the question why. Why is this change necessary? The benefits of successful implementation, or what is in it for us and you, as well as the details of the change. When, where, who is involved, how much will it cost, etc. Another successful change management indication that change management is being successful is to devise an effective education, training, and/or skills upgrading program for the organization. You can also counter resistance from the employees of the company and align them with the organization's overall strategic direction. You could also provide personal counseling if required to alleviate any change-related fears. And lastly, you can monitor the implementation and fine-tune as required. So once we've decided to move into the world of e-business and we've thought about an e-commerce solution, a platform approach, and all of these various things, we have to start to think about how we're going to organize e-commerce within our organization. Where is the e-commerce unit going to be? And we've got several different options. They can be a sub-department, if you will, of the marketing department, or the finance department. They could report directly to the chief operating officer. So there's a variety of different levels that the e-commerce department can be. We have to make that decision and give them the proper authority that they need to be able to conduct business. In other words, if they're too low within the organization, that would signify that e-commerce is probably not a major priority within that particular organization. We can also create an autonomous division or a separate online company. That's certainly a completely different approach that we could take. And it really starts to indicate just what we think of e-commerce and how it's going to impact the future of our business in terms of where we place them within our organization or if we set them up as a separate company. The authors make a point to look at successes and failures of past e-commerce initiatives in an effort to identify trends that have been successful or failed to help an organization identify what to do more of and what to do less of. And so they start out by talking about e-commerce failures. And they take kind of an unusual approach, I think, when they first start out on page 670. And we look at it from a macroeconomic, mid-economic level, and a microeconomic level. I think suffice to say, looking at the microeconomic is probably the most telling when they talk about the overallocation of scarce resources, such as venture capital and technical personnel, and too many advertising-driven business models. This is that irrational exuberance that I talked about earlier, where essentially anybody that threw E in front of something got a lot of money, even if their plan didn't happen to really warrant any sort of investment from investors. Really, some of the underlying reasons for e-commerce failures included things like a lack of profitability, excessive risk exposure, high cost of customer acquisition, poor performance, static websites, as well as some financial reasons, including lack of funding and incorrect revenue models. Similar to looking at the failures, looking at success also gives you some insight. It tells you what to do, what did work, and hopefully what would continue to work in the future. So looking at success stories is definitely a good thing to do as well. And there are a number of success stories, especially in niche markets and specialty markets. Some examples include Puritan's Pride, employment sites such as Monster, Priceline, Netflix, Amazon.com, Facebook, Google, etc. As far as strategies for success, some specific, more actionable strategies, realize that institutional-based trust is a must, or is a big deal. In other words, establishing trust with the customer and making it so that the customer trusts your organization. You can do that by using security mechanisms and making sure that the customers are aware of those. Belonging to the Better Business Bureau, using the trustee symbol, things like that. Selecting robust business models, anticipating the .com future. In other words, being very aware of trends and what's trending upwards. Fostering e-innovation, again, being on the cutting edge. Carefully evaluating spin-off strategies, co-branding, employing X.com staffers, and focus on the e-generation. Pricing is also another important strategy that you have to grapple with in order to be successful, to be able to account for and address shipping issues. Less of an issue if you're dealing with digital products, but certainly when you're talking about physical products, that's something you have to account for in your cost structure. And new technologies, effective marketing management, having an attractive website, and building strong connections with the customers. These are all very important concepts or things that you need to consider when you're talking about the e-business and wanting to make sure that you're successful. As far as some of the cultural differences, critical elements that can affect the value of e-commerce across cultures are perceived trust, customer loyalty, regulation, and political influence. Even the content of online ads can mean different things in different cultures. So Be aware of that. E-commerce success factors differ among countries, and so do adoption strategies. Similar to cultural differences, developed and developing economies vary in how e-commerce is used and whether the economics favor this channel of commerce. Developing economies struggle with various issues taken for granted in developed economies, such as the United States or Singapore. Developing economies often face power blackouts, unreliable telecommunications infrastructure, undependable delivery mechanisms, and the fact that only a few customers own computers and credit cards. Such limitations make it difficult for firms to predict whether e-commerce investments will pay off, and if so, when. However, developing economies such as China and India, and yes, those are technically developing economies, represent a significant opportunity for e-commerce to connect to businesses, customers, as well as other businesses. A major booster for e-commerce in developing countries is the increasing use of low-cost laptop computers in a wireless environment, with computer costs less than $150 in 2011, and the widespread use of cell phones with internet access and free access in public places, it's likely that e-commerce will increase significantly in developing countries in the future. Exhibit 13.21 illustrates graphically some of the critical success factors in e-commerce in the old economy versus the e-commerce economy, if you will, and kind of helps you to differentiate between those two. So take a look at through each of those. Some of the managerial issues for this chapter include determining how the value of e-commerce investment should be justified, and which investment analysis methods should we adopt for e-commerce justification. Remember, we talked about several different approaches in terms of using things like return on investment or net present value, payback period, and break-even analysis, things like that. And the reality is we probably should use more than one. It's always a good idea to triangulate our findings. And so it's definitely a wise approach to use more than one. In some cases, we have flexibility. It's really kind of left up to us to determine which particular metric we decide to choose, or metrics, plural. In other cases, organizations will require that the return on investment be calculated or the payback period be calculated, in which case we simply have to do the analysis based on those criteria. As far as who should conduct the justification, probably more than one person / group. Certainly you would want somebody that is disinterested in the outcome of the project. That way it's a neutral perspective. Yet at the same time you want preferably more than one party to do it just for verification purposes. Should we use the hype cycle? I think if you read the end of the chapter, your answer should have to be yes. The idea is that you want to stay keenly aware of technologies that are coming down the pike. And that's kind of what the hype cycle is all about, is to help you predict the latest and greatest in terms of technologies and at what stage they're at in their particular growth cycle. What is the outsourcing strategy of our organization? Are we going to build things internally? Are we going to outsource? Are we going to purchase e-commerce solutions off the shelf? We need to consider that. If we want to be a particularly lean company, it means we're probably going to rely on outsourcing more than other companies. Should we embark on cloud computing products for our e-commerce initiatives? Again, if we're going to be a particularly lean company, that may be one strategy to employ rather than outsourcing per se. We could simply use cloud computing and offload a lot of the responsibility to people who, that's their job, that's what they're good at. Which strategy should we choose for vendor selection, the inside out or outside in approach? Really depends on the industry that you're in, the organization that you're in, the corporate culture that you're in. What kinds of organizational changes may be needed? Well, I mean, you're going to be talking about purchasing a variety of different types of technologies, or at least services for those technologies. Certainly your business processes are going to end up changing, being modified to adapt to the software that you're using, or changing the software to meet your organizational processes. So this is a process that, because change is painful, it creates anxiety among employees. It's a process that needs to be managed, and so there's a section in the book that talks about managing organizational change. Is it possible to predict e-commerce success? Well, if it was, when we predicted that it wasn't going to occur, we would avoid that project altogether, wouldn't we? Certainly it's possible to stack the deck in our favor, and we can do certain things that increase the likelihood of an e-commerce initiative's success potential. But to truly predict it, no, we can't quite do that. So in this chapter, we talked about the major components of e-commerce implementation. Essentially, there are four major categories: justification and economics, acquiring and/or developing the e-commerce systems, assurance of organizational readiness and performance of necessary restructuring, training, and so forth, and cultivating the necessary success factors while avoiding the mistakes. We also talked about the need for justification. We need to be able to determine whether or not it's a necessary endeavor. Not all e-commerce applications need to be justified. Some are going to be particularly small. Some of them are not going to be our choice. They may be mandated. So in some cases, there's not necessarily a need for justification. We talked about the difficulties in justifying an e-commerce investment, that sometimes the numbers are difficult to obtain. There are sometimes intangible costs and intangible benefits that are difficult to determine. We talked about the difficulties in established intangible metrics. Intangible benefits may be difficult to define. Some of these benefits change rapidly, and others have different values to different people or organizational units. So it makes them difficult to figure out. We talked about traditional methods for evaluating e-commerce investments, such as return on investment, net present value, payback period, etc. We talked about describing the justification of representative e-commerce projects. The justification of an e-commerce project starts with a needs analysis and then involves listing all the costs and benefits. We also talked about the e-commerce economic evaluation. Economic fundamentals must be kept in mind when evaluating e-commerce investment. When non-digital products, with non-digital products, the cost curve shows the average per unit cost decline as quantity increases. However, with digital products, the variable cost per unit usually is low. In other words, it doesn't cost you any more really to make a copy, and thus the evaluation will differ. We talked about the major steps in developing an e-commerce system, and the need to develop e-commerce systems in a systematic fashion so that we can make sure that we're going through each step necessary in a thoughtful and meaningful way. We talked about the major e-commerce development strategies along with their advantages and disadvantages. E-commerce sites and applications are rarely built from scratch. We're usually building on top of something that already exists. In some cases, we're buying prepackaged e-commerce suites. In other cases, we're building our own. So there's a lot of different ways that we can go about building our e-commerce application. We talked about the varied e-commerce application development methods along with their benefits and limitations. We talked about e-commerce application outsourcing strategies. We talked about criteria used in selecting software vendors and packages. We talked about the impact of e-markets on organization and how it goes about changing an organization. We talked about business process management, business process re-engineering, for example. And then we finished up talking about reasons for e-commerce success and failure, with the idea being that by looking at failures, we could identify things that we needed to avoid. And by looking at successes, we can identify things that we hopefully can do better and continue to do in the future. This concludes Chapter 13, Implementing E-Commerce Systems from Justification to Successful Performance. Thank you.